The sky didn't just darken, it fell. One moment, the sun was a hazy, indifferent coin in the pale afternoon sky. The next, the world outside the diner window was a churning bruise of purple and slate gray. A low rumble vibrated through the cheap linoleum floor of the Dusty Spoon Diner, a promise of violence from the heavens. Inside, the sparse collection of patrons, a tired waitress, a couple of truckers, a family huddled in a corner booth, glanced up from their lukewarm coffee and greasy plates. They saw the change in the light and felt the change in the air. They also saw the men who had brought their own kind of storm inside with them, 5 of them. They had rumbled up an hour ago on machines that sounded like thunder long before the real thunder began. Their leather vests, called cuts, were worn and scarred, bearing the emblem of a coiled serpent with a helping hand extending from its fangs. The Serpent's Hand Motorcycle Club. The name itself was a contradiction, and so were the men. They took the largest booth at the back, a silent, imposing mountain range of denim and leather. The man at the head of the table was Deacon. His hair was more salt than pepper, pulled back in a tight, disciplined tail. A scar, thin and white, cut a path from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a permanent record of a past he never spoke of. His eyes, though, were the most unsettling part. They were a pale, clear gray, and they missed nothing. They saw the waitress's nervous tremor, the way the truckers avoided his gaze, the way the family pulled their children just a little bit closer. He drank his black coffee and said nothing, a king presiding over a silent, fearful court. To his right sat Bear, a man who lived up to his name. He was immense, a wall of muscle and beard that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His knuckles were swollen and scarred, but he used his massive hands to meticulously fold his paper napkin into a perfect square. Beside him, Doc, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, cleaned his glasses with a small cloth, his movements precise and calm. He was the club's medic, and his hands, unlike Bear's, were steady and surgical. On Deacon's left were Vixen and Wraith. Vixen was the only woman in their group, her fiery red hair braided down her back. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and her gaze was as intense as Deacon's. She watched the other patrons with a cool, analytical distance. Wraith was younger, leaner, his fingers constantly swiping and tapping at a phone that seemed surgically attached to his hand. He was their eyes and ears in a world that ran on information, a ghost in the machine. They were a complete, self-contained unit, an island of quiet menace in the sea of the diner's mundane existence. Then the first drop of rain hit the window. It was thick and heavy, like a pellet of ice. Another followed, and another, and then the sky tore open. A torrential downpour lashed the building, drumming against the roof and blurring the world outside into a gray watercolor painting. A flash of lightning bleached the diner in a stark, skeletal white, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it rattled the silverware on the tables. A small whimper cut through the sound of the storm. It came from the corner booth. The family. The father, a man in a polo shirt, shushed his young son. But the sound hadn't come from the boy. It came from his sister, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her name was Lily. She had big, frightened blue eyes and a pale, drawn face. She wasn't looking at the storm. She was looking out the window, her small hands pressed against the glass. Tied to the metal bike rack just outside the diner's entrance was a small, scruffy dog. A mutt of indeterminate heritage, with one floppy ear and a coat the color of dirty snow. He was pulling against his leash, whining in terror as the rain plastered his fur to his skinny frame. Each clap of thunder sent him into a fresh panic, and he scrabbled at the wet concrete, trying to find shelter that wasn't there. Lily's own whimper grew louder. Tears welled in her eyes, tracing clean paths down her dusty cheeks. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Patches. We have to bring Patches in." A man across the table from her, a man with a pressed shirt and a cold, dismissive face, didn't even look up from his phone. This was not her father. This was Mr. Gentry, her mother's new husband. "He's a dog, Lily. He'll be fine. A little rain won't hurt him." His tone was smooth, but with an edge of irritation that made the girl flinch. "But he's scared," she pleaded. "Look at him. Please, Mr. Gentry." "I said he's fine," Mr. Gentry snapped. his voice low and sharp. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "Do not make a scene." The girl's mother said nothing. She just stared into her coffee cup, a ghost at her own table. Lily looked from her mother's vacant face to Mr. Gentry's cruel one. There was no help there. Her lower lip trembled, and she turned her gaze from the window, her desperate eyes scanning the diner. They passed over the truckers, the waitress, and then they landed on the back booth. They landed on the mountain range of leather and scars. They landed on Deacon. For a long moment, she just stared. She saw the scarred face, the tattoos that snaked up his neck, the imposing stillness that radiated power. Every instinct a child is taught screamed at her to look away, to hide. The man was a monster from a storybook. He was the wolf. He was the troll under the bridge. But then she looked at his eyes again. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. They were just watching, calm and steady. And in that moment, trapped between the storm outside and the storm at her own table, Lily made a choice. It was an act of pure, desperate courage. She slid out of her booth. Her small sneakers made no sound on the worn floor. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The clatter of forks stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. The only sounds were the roar of the storm and the soft, terrified padding of a little girl walking toward the monsters. Mr. Gentry's head snapped up, his face darkening with rage. "Lily, get back here right now." She ignored him. She kept her eyes fixed on Deacon. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his gaze was locked on her, an unbreakable connection. She reached the edge of their table, so small she barely came up to the tabletop. The men around him were enormous, blocking out the light. Bear looked down at her, his brow furrowed, a giant contemplating a dandelion. Lily stopped, clutching the fabric of her simple dress in her fists. She had to tilt her head all the way back to look up at Deacon. She took a shaky breath, her small chest rising and falling. The words came out in a whisper, almost lost in the next crash of thunder. "Please, sir." Deacon leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, like gravel rolling downhill. It wasn't loud, but it cut through every other sound in the room. "What is it, little one?" Tears were streaming freely down her face now, mixing with the dust and grime. "It's my dog," she said, her voice cracking. "His name is Patches. He's outside. He's scared of the storm. Mr. Gentry won't let me bring him in. Can you help him? Can you keep him safe?" The plea hung in the dead silent diner. A child asking a monster for protection. It was a question that demanded more than a simple answer. It was a test. The waitress stood frozen, a coffee pot in her hand. The truckers stared, their mouths slightly agape. Mr. Gentry was halfway out of his seat, his face a mask of fury and embarrassment. "Lily, I told you to get back here. Do not bother these gentlemen." Deacon didn't even glance at him. His pale gray eyes never left the little girl's face. He saw the genuine terror there, but he also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a desperate belief that he, the scariest thing in the room, might also be the kindest. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise hidden just below her hairline, a shadow that didn't belong on a child's skin. He saw the way she flinched when Mr. Gentry raised his voice. He saw everything. Slowly, deliberately, Deacon pushed his chair back. The sound scraped loudly in the silent room. He stood up, and he was taller than anyone expected. He unfolded to his full height, a man carved from old wood and hard miles. And then he did something that shocked everyone. He knelt. He went down on one knee, bringing himself level with the terrified little girl, the worn leather of his pants creaking in protest. Now they were eye to eye. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its harsh edge. "Lily," she whispered. "Well, Lily," Deacon said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "My name's Deacon, and of course we'll help your dog." He looked over his shoulder at the mountain beside him. "Bear, go get the dog." Bear didn't hesitate. He rose from the booth, his huge frame seeming to suck the air out of the room. He moved with a surprising grace for a man his size. He gave Lily a clumsy, reassuring nod as he passed, his expression a mixture of concern and grim determination. He strode to the door, pushed it open, and walked out into the maelstrom without so much as a flinch, the wind and rain swallowing him whole. "Insolent child," Mr. Gentry hissed, finally reaching their table. He grabbed Lily's arm, his fingers digging in. "We are leaving. You have caused enough trouble." Lily cried out, a sharp yelp of pain. Before Mr. Gentry could pull her away, Deacon's hand shot out. It didn't grab, it didn't strike. It simply rested on Mr. Gentry's wrist, covering it completely. Deacon's hand was weathered and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but the pressure he applied was calm and absolute. It was like being stopped by a steel bar. "Let go of the girl," Deacon said. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact. Mr. Gentry tried to pull his arm away, but it was useless. He was pinned. A flicker of fear, quickly masked by outrage, crossed his face. "Who do you think you are? This is my stepdaughter. This is a family matter." He tried to project authority, his voice dripping with condescension. "I appreciate your concern, but we can handle it." "You'll handle it by leaving her dog to suffer in a storm? By grabbing her hard enough to leave marks?" Deacon's voice was dangerously quiet. His gray eyes were fixed on Gentry's hand, still clamped on Lily's arm. "I said, let go." The pressure on Gentry's wrist increased infinitesimally, but it was enough. The man's knuckles went white. With a strangled curse, he released Lily's arm. She scrambled back, hiding behind Deacon's leg, peering out at the man who was supposed to be her protector. The diner door opened again, and Bear stepped back inside, rain streaming from his hair and beard. He was soaked to the bone, but in his arms he carried a shivering, wet bundle of fur. Patches. The little dog was trembling violently, but he seemed to understand he was safe. He licked Bear's beard, his tail giving a tentative thump-thump-thump against the big man's leather vest. Bear carried the dog as if it were made of fine china. He walked over to their booth and gently set the dog down on the seat. Doc was already there, pulling a clean, dry rag from one of his saddlebags that he brought inside. He began to gently towel off the shivering animal. Vixen had moved to sit beside the dog, murmuring soft, comforting words to it. It was a scene of such unexpected tenderness that it seemed impossible. These hard, frightening people were cooing over a wet dog, treating it with more care than the girl's own stepfather had shown her. This entire situation was a portrait of choices. The choice of a little girl to trust a stranger, the choice of a group of outcasts to show compassion, and the choice of a man like Gentry to reveal the ugliness behind his polished mask. In a world full of noise, sometimes the most important moments are the quiet decisions that define who we really are. If you believe that a single act of kindness can change the world, and that true strength is found in defending those who have none, then take a moment to show your support, because stories like this need to be told. Kindness is a language everyone understands, even if it comes from the most unexpected places. Mr. Gentry stared at the scene, his face a thundercloud of rage and humiliation. His authority had been challenged and overthrown in a public diner by a group he considered societal refuse. "This is absurd," he sputtered, straightening his tie as if that could restore his dignity. "I am this child's legal guardian. You have no right to interfere." Deacon rose slowly to his full height, making Gentry crane his neck to look up at him. The difference between them was stark. Gentry was soft, his expensive suit hiding a body that had never known a day of hard labor. Deacon was lean, hard, every line on his face and every scar on his skin earned. "Rights? You want to talk about rights?" Deacon's voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "You lost your rights when you left a terrified animal chained up in a thunderstorm. You lost them when you put your hands on this child in anger." "I did no such thing," Gentry blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "She's a dramatic, disobedient child. She needs discipline." From behind Deacon, Vixen spoke, her voice sharp and clear. "Discipline? Or an excuse?" She had moved from the dog to Lily, kneeling beside her. Lily was no longer hiding, but was pressed against Vixen's side, drawing strength from her presence. Wraith, who had been silent this whole time, finally looked up from his phone. He didn't speak to Gentry, he spoke to Deacon. "Deacon, his name is Richard Gentry. Financial consultant, 2 previous complaints filed with Child Protective Services in the last 3 years. Both dismissed for lack of evidence. One was for neglect, the other, physical abuse. The complainant was a schoolteacher. The words fell into the room like stones into a still pond. Each one created a ripple of shock. The waitress gasped. One of the truckers swore under his breath. Mr. Gentry's face went from red to a pasty white. "Those are lies, slander. How did you? You can't just access private information." "The world is full of information, Mr. Gentry," Wraith said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You just have to know where to look. And people who hide behind expensive suits and big words usually have the most to hide." He put his phone away, his job done. This is harassment," Gentry stammered, his composure shattering. He was looking for an escape, his eyes darting around the diner, but there was nowhere to go. The truckers were on their feet now, blocking the aisle. The waitress stood by the kitchen door, her hand holding a heavy-duty ladle like a weapon. The entire diner had turned against him. They had all feared the bikers, but now they saw who the real monster was. The real monster was the man in the clean, pressed shirt. Doc, who had finished drying the dog, now turned his attention to Lily. He knelt beside Vixen. "Hey there, Lily. I'm Doc. I heard you got a little scrape earlier. Mind if I take a look?" His voice was gentle, clinical, and utterly non-threatening. Lily, reassured by Vixen, nodded shyly. Doc gently pushed back the hair from her forehead. The yellowing bruise was clearly visible now under the diner's fluorescent lights. But Doc's trained eyes saw more. He gently took her arm, the one Gentry had grabbed. "Does this hurt?" he asked, his fingers probing lightly near her wrist. She winced, a tiny, involuntary movement. Doc's face remained passive, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He looked up at Deacon, and his message was clear without a single word being spoken. The man was guilty. "She fell," Gentry said quickly, his voice high and strained. "She's a clumsy child, always falling down." Deacon took a step toward him. He didn't rush, he didn't threaten. He just moved, and the space between them shrank. Gentry took an involuntary step back, bumping into the table behind him. "You know," Deacon said, his voice a conversational murmur, "I spent 20 years in the service, saw a lot of things, saw men in combat, saw what real fear looks like. But you know the ugliest thing I ever saw? It's the look in the eyes of a bully when he's finally confronted by someone who isn't afraid of him. It's the look you're wearing right now." Gentry's facade of respectability was completely gone. In its place was a raw, panicked snarl. He was a cornered animal. "You can't do this. I'll call the police. I'll have all of you arrested for assault, for kidnapping." "We already called them," Deacon said calmly. "They should be here any minute. We figured they'd be interested in talking to a man with your history. And we have a whole diner full of witnesses who saw you assault a child, who saw you leave an animal in distress, who heard you admit she needed discipline." The sound of a siren cut through the storm, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. Hope drained from Gentry's face, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He had built his life on a foundation of lies and intimidation, and it was all crumbling down around him. He had believed his money and his social standing made him untouchable. He had underestimated the courage of a little girl, and he had fatally, catastrophically, underestimated the men in leather vests. He made one last desperate move. He lunged, not for the door, but for Lily. A wild, foolish attempt to grab his shield, his victim, back. He never had a chance. Bear moved. It was like watching a mountain decide to shift. He didn't punch. He didn't shove. He simply stepped between Gentry and the girl, planting his feet. Gentry ran into Bear's chest and stopped dead, as if he had run into a brick wall. The air rushed out of his lungs in a whoosh. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Bear just looked down at him, his expression not of anger, but of deep, profound disappointment. "Bad choice," he rumbled. "Very bad choice." The siren was deafening now. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain-streaked windows, painting the scene in frantic, pulsing colors. Two sheriff's deputies pushed through the door, their hands resting on their sidearms, their faces grim and ready for trouble. They surveyed the scene, the hulking bikers, the terrified man in the suit, the small child being comforted by the red-haired woman. The lead deputy, a man with a weathered face and a name tag that read Sheriff Brody, looked at Deacon. He knew of the serpent's hand. He knew their reputation. "Deacon, what's going on here?" Deacon didn't move from his spot. He simply nodded toward the cowering Gentry. "Evening, Sheriff. This man, Richard Gentry, was creating a public disturbance. We witnessed him assault his stepdaughter, Lily, and his past record might be of interest to you as well." Sheriff Brody looked at Gentry, then at Lily, who was peering at him from the safety of Vixen's embrace. He saw the bruise on her forehead. He saw the red marks on her arm. He saw the terror in her eyes when she looked at her stepfather. And he saw the way the little scruffy dog, now warm and dry, growled low in its chest from the booth, its body tense to protect its girl. A dog's instincts were rarely wrong. "Mr. Gentry," the sheriff said, his voice hard as iron, "I'm going to need you to come with me. We have a few things to discuss." "It's a misunderstanding," Gentry shrieked, his voice cracking. "They're lying. They're criminals. Look at them." The sheriff glanced around the diner, at the truckers standing like sentinels, at the waitress holding her ladle, at Deacon and his crew who stood not as aggressors, but as guardians. "Right now," Sheriff Brody said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, "they look like witnesses, and you look like the criminal." The click of the handcuffs snapping onto Gentry's wrists was the loudest sound in the diner. It was the sound of a lock turning, the sound of a cage door closing, the sound of justice. As the deputies led the sputtering, protesting man out into the storm, a profound quiet settled over the room. The tension that had been stretched to its breaking point finally snapped, leaving behind a strange sense of peace. The storm outside was beginning to subside. The thunder was a distant rumble now, and the rain had softened to a gentle drumming on the roof. The light outside was slowly returning. Deacon finally turned back to Lily. He knelt down once more. The little girl looked from the departing police car to Deacon's scarred face. She didn't see a monster anymore. She saw a knight, her knight. She launched herself forward and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, burying her face in the rough leather of his vest. "Thank you," she sobbed. "You saved Patches. You saved me." Deacon was still for a moment, unused to such contact. Then his large calloused hand came up and rested gently on her back, holding her steady. "It's all right, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "You're safe now. We've got you." Around them, his club watched. Bear had a tear glistening in his thick beard. Vixen's sharp eyes were soft. Doc was smiling, a genuine warm smile. They were the serpent's hand. Outcasts, rejects, feared by a world that didn't understand them. But in that moment, in a greasy roadside diner, they were a family, and they had just welcomed a new member. The aftermath was quiet efficiency. While Sheriff Brody took Gentry to the station, the bikers took care of Lily. The diner owner, a stout woman named Marge, who had watched the whole thing from the kitchen, came out with a plate piled high with pancakes shaped like a smiley face, a tall glass of milk, and a bowl of scraps for Patches. "On the house," she said, her voice firm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "For all of you, anything you want, on the house for life." Deacon just nodded his thanks. The focus was on the child. Vixen sat in the booth with Lily, helping her cut her pancakes, talking to her in a low, soothing voice. Lily, for the first time since they had entered the diner, was starting to relax. The color was returning to her cheeks. She even managed a small giggle when Patches, sitting on the seat beside her, sneakily stole a piece of bacon off her plate. Doc made a quiet call. He had a friend, a pediatrician in the next town, who agreed to meet them after hours to check Lily over properly, to document her injuries in a way that would be legally airtight. Wraith was on his phone again, but this time he was not looking for criminal records. He was digging into Lily's family history, looking for a safe place for her to land. "Her mother is not a viable guardian," he said quietly to Deacon. "Too intimidated by Gentry. But there's a grandmother, her maternal grandmother, in Oregon. Lost touch a few years ago when her daughter married this guy." "Find her," Deacon ordered. "Get a number. We'll make the call." The bikers worked like a well-oiled machine, each member fulfilling a role. Bear stood watch by the door, a silent, immovable guardian, ensuring no other threats would appear. Doc prepared a small first aid kit. Vixen provided emotional first aid, the kind no hospital could offer. Wraith navigated the digital world, searching for a lifeline, and Deacon, their leader, oversaw it all, his calm presence a rock for everyone to anchor to. Lily, full of pancakes and feeling safer than she had in years, was starting to get sleepy. She looked up at Deacon, who was sipping a fresh cup of coffee Marge had brought him. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice small and drowsy. "Everyone else is scared of you." Deacon looked at her for a long moment, considering his answer. How could he explain their code to a child? How could he explain the deep, unshakable belief that the strong had a sacred duty to protect the weak? He thought about his own past, about the helplessness he had once felt, a feeling he had sworn no child should ever experience on his watch. "Arves," he said, tapping the serpent patch on his chest. "People see the snake and they think of danger, of poison. They're not wrong. We can be dangerous." He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers. "But they don't see the other part, the hand. We are the serpent's hand. The snake is for our enemies, for people like him." He nodded toward the door where Gentry had been taken away. "But the hand is for people like you, for anyone who needs help and has nowhere else to turn. We lend our strength to those who have none," he went on, his voice a low confessional rumble. "A long time ago, people we were supposed to trust failed us. Each of us here," he gestured to his club, "we've all been hurt, we've all been let down. We know what it's like to be small and scared in a world full of big, mean people. So we made a promise to each other, that we would never, ever let that happen to a child. Not on our watch, not ever." It was the simplest, most honest explanation he could give. It was their gospel. The wounded become the healers, the outcasts become the guardians. Lily didn't understand all the words, but she understood the feeling behind them. She understood the promise. She rested her head against Vixen's shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed. Patches curled up at her feet on the vinyl seat. Bear, seeing her drift off, came over and with a surprising gentleness lifted her into his arms. She didn't even stir. She just snuggled into his massive chest, one small hand clutching his leather vest. The bikers stayed for another hour, waiting for the call from the pediatrician and for Wraith to confirm the grandmother's contact information. The diner slowly emptied out, the truckers and other patrons leaving with backward glances not of fear, but of awe and respect. The story of what happened at the Dusty Spoon would spread through the town, carried on the airwaves of CB radios and through hushed conversations over backyard fences. The legend of the serpent's hand began to change that night, from one of menace to one of myth. Finally, Wraith gave a triumphant nod. "Got her, Eleanor Vance. She's on the phone. She's been trying to get in touch with Lily for 2 years. Gentry blocked her number and returned her letters." Deacon took the phone. He stepped outside into the clean, rain-washed night air and spoke to a woman hundreds of miles away, a woman who was about to have her granddaughter returned to her. His voice was calm, reassuring, explaining the situation with clarity and compassion. Arrangements were made. A flight would be booked. The club would watch Lily until Eleanor could get there. When he came back inside, the plan was set. They were no longer just passing through. They had a mission. They would get a room at the local motel, take turns watching over the sleeping girl and her dog, and ensure a safe handover to her grandmother. They were all in. They were always all in. As they prepared to leave, Marge, the diner owner, stopped Deacon. She pressed a folded $100 bill into his hand. "For the girl," she said. Deacon tried to refuse, but she was insistent. "You take it. You buy her something nice, and you tell that sweet child that she has a whole town looking out for her now." Deacon looked at the money, then at the woman's determined, kind face. He nodded, folded the bill carefully, and tucked it into his vest pocket. They walked out of the diner, Bear still carrying the sleeping Lily, Doc carrying a sleepy Patches. They left behind a room that was no longer filled with fear, but with a lingering sense of wonder. They had ridden in as monsters, and they would ride out as heroes. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on a small, well-tended garden in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. A profusion of roses and daisies bloomed in a riot of color. In the middle of the lawn, a little girl with bright blue eyes and a wide, happy smile threw a tennis ball for a scruffy dog with one floppy ear. Lily was no longer pale and drawn. She was vibrant, healthy, and filled with the uncomplicated joy of an 8-year-old. Patches, her faithful companion, bounded after the ball, his tail a blur of motion. An older woman with kind eyes and silver hair, Eleanor Vance, watched from the porch, a soft smile on her face. "Lily, lunch is ready." Lily scooped up the dog and ran toward the house. Taped to the screen door was her latest drawing. It depicted 5 figures. One was an enormous smiling man covered in hair, labeled Bear. Another was a tall, kind-faced man with a silver eagle on his vest, labeled Deacon. The other figures, Vixen, Doc, and Wraith, surrounded a small girl and a dog. Above them all, she had drawn a giant coiled snake with a hand reaching out from its mouth, offering a flower. Hundreds of miles away, at the Dusty Spoon Diner, a similar picture hung in a frame behind the counter, right next to the health inspection certificate. It was the first drawing Lily had made for them, given to Deacon the day her grandmother arrived to take her home. Marge, the diner owner, polished the glass every morning. Tourists and truckers would sometimes ask about it, and Marge would tell them the story. The story of the storm, the little girl, and the bikers who were more than they seemed. The diner had become more popular than ever, a small landmark on a lonely highway, a place where a legend was born. The $100 bill Marge had given Deacon was also framed. It hung on the wall of the Serpent's Hand clubhouse, in a place of honor. It was their rainy day fund, but everyone knew it would never be spent. It was a reminder, a symbol of their true purpose. The roar of engines echoed down a dusty road in a different state, a different town. The Serpent's Hand rode in formation, Deacon at the lead. They were just passing through, on their way to a rally. They pulled into a gas station to refuel. As they dismounted, the usual reactions occurred. People gave them a wide berth. A mother pulled her child closer. The whispers started. But this time, something was different. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, broke away from his father. He wasn't scared. He approached Deacon with a look of wide-eyed admiration. "Are you them?" the boy asked, his voice full of awe. Deacon looked down at him, one eyebrow raised. "Them who?" "The Serpent's Hand," the boy said. "My cousin's a trucker. He told me about you. About how you saved a girl and her dog from a bad man in a storm." Deacon's expression softened. The story had traveled. It had taken on a life of its own, a modern-day fable passed from one traveler to another. He knelt, just as he had for Lily, bringing himself down to the boy's level. "Yeah, kid," he said, a true smile reaching his eyes. "That was us." The boy beamed. "I knew it. My dad said you were just trouble, but I knew you were heroes." Deacon reached into his vest and pulled out a small polished stone he kept for good luck. He pressed it into the boy's hand. "Real heroes don't wear capes," he said. "They just show up when they're needed. You remember that." He stood up, gave the boy a nod, and walked toward his bike. His club followed, their boots crunching on the gravel. They were still big. They were still scarred. They were still intimidating. But something had changed. Or maybe nothing had changed about them at all. The world had just finally started to see them for who they truly were. They mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life in a chorus of controlled power. As they pulled out of the gas station and back onto the open road, they rode not as outlaws, but as guardians, forever searching for the next storm, forever ready to offer a helping hand.